The end of one of the world's biggest manhunts. Donald Trump says the leader of ISIL blew himself up during a raid by U.S. Special Forces. What does Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's death mean for the internationally designated terrorist group? And is his dream of a self-declared caliphate finally over? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. He was one of the world's most wanted men, a prized target for years. The US president says Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of one of the most feared armed groups, ISIL, has been hunted down in northwest Syria. Donald Trump says he killed himself with explosives during a raid by US Special Forces. Al-Baghdadi once ruled an area in Syria and Iraq the size of the United Kingdom. Under his watch, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant became one of the most brutal armed groups in modern history, carrying out mass killings, beheadings, and rape campaigns. Here's what U.S. President Donald Trump had to say.
Last night, the United States brought the world's #1 terrorist leader to justice. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead. He was the founder and leader of ISIS, the most ruthless and violent terror organization anywhere in the world. The United States has been searching for Baghdadi for many years. Capturing or killing Baghdadi has been the top national security priority of my administration. U.S. Special Operations Forces executed a dangerous and daring nighttime raid in northwestern Syria and accomplished their mission in grand style. The U.S. personnel were incredible. I got to watch much of it. He died after running into a dead-end tunnel, whimpering and crying and screaming all the way. The compound had been cleared by this time, with people either surrendering or being shot and killed. 11 young children were moved out of the house and are uninjured. He reached the end of the tunnel as our dogs chased him down. He ignited his vest, killing himself and the 3 children. His body was mutilated by the blast. The tunnel had caved in on it in addition. But test results gave certain, immediate, and totally positive identification. It was him.
Zaina Khoda has more now on how Baghdadi became ISIL leader.
It was July 2014 when the world got a glimpse of the man best known as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, an Iraqi whose real name is Ibrahim Awad Ibrahim al-Badri. He walked out of the shadows to declare an Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. From the great mosque in the Iraqi city of Mosul, he led Friday prayers after naming himself caliph or religious leader. It was a show of power by an armed group which took over much of Iraq's Sunni heartland after the Iraqi army all but collapsed. 5 years later, it was Baghdadi's state that collapsed. ISIL once controlled 88,000 square kilometers of territory, stretching from western Syria to eastern Iraq. It lost its last stronghold in Syria in March this year. Weeks after, Baghdadi made his first appearance in 5 years, putting to rest many unconfirmed reports of his deaths. In a video, the ISIL leader wanted to show he was still in charge, and along with his group, survived the territorial defeat. Baghdadi was behind the group's creation and expansion. ISIL originated in Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Baghdadi became its leader in 2010. He then capitalized on the unrest in neighboring Syria, exploiting the security vacuum. It started to capture territory and changed its name to Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant before falling out with Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. ISIL now challenges Al-Qaeda not only in Syria and Iraq, but for the leadership of what it calls the global jihadist struggle. Baghdadi was once a prisoner in a US-run jail in Iraq. He is believed to have been born near the Iraqi city of Samarra in 1971 and said to have a PhD in Islamic studies from an Iraqi university, giving him religious credentials. It isn't known what role Baghdadi played in recruiting Arab and foreign fighters or in orchestrating attacks abroad. There have been questions about his grip on power and reports of dissent within the group's leadership. But the man who declared himself caliph, the would-be successor of the Prophet, managed to elude death and capture for years. And even though ISIL's state in Syria and Iraq crumbled under his rule, the group's goals are not defined by borders or one man. Its appeal comes from harnessing the grievances of Sunni Muslims in Iraq, Syria, and across the world. Sana Khudr, Al Jazeera.
All right, well, let's introduce our panel now to talk more about this. Here in Doha, we have Andreas Krieg, an assistant professor at the Defense Studies Department at King's College London. Joining us from Erbil in the Kurdistan region of Iraq is Hiwa Osman, who is an Iraqi political analyst. And via Skype from Luz in the U.S. state of Delaware, Lawrence Korb, a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense. Welcome, all of you. So, Andreas, let me start with you then. How significant is this in terms of the fight, the larger fight against ISIL?
I think it is mostly of symbolic importance here, especially for the organization. And I've said for years that this organization has become somewhat of a virtual caliphate. It's become a franchise that other groups can buy into and then basically sell around the world. And it was not a caliphate, it was a cyber caliphate, if you will, without a caliph. And I think killing the so-called self-proclaimed caliph today doesn't really make any difference in that. Because the different groups that have existed and continue to exist after the collapse of the physical caliphate will continue and are continuing to fight anyway in the underground in Syria and Iraq, but also in Afghanistan, in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. So this title of being ISIS is up for grabs, and it's a virtual community that is very much leaderless and has been leaderless.
Hiwa Osman, what's your view on this? Does the killing of one leader, one man, matter in the larger scheme of things?
Well, looking at their track record, at the track record of these radical groups, these terrorist groups, when Zarqawi, for example, was killed, the group was very quick to appoint another person to be in charge. When Osama bin Laden was killed, the group Al-Qaeda was also very quick to appoint someone else in charge in his place. I think we will hear the same thing from ISIS, that they will appoint somebody else. It deals a major blow to the organization, I think, but it will not affect the status of the cyber caliphate as the guest in Doha described. I think he's accurate. It has become a franchise. People subscribe to it, and they conduct attacks and they carry out activities in the name of that terror group, especially now in Iraq and in Syria mostly, with the presence of Turkish troops inside northeast Syria, the area that was controlled by the SDF, a staunch enemy of ISIS. We saw how the Turkish troops came in with their Syrian proxies, who were very much similar to the ISIS, to members of ISIS. So the ecosystem, I think, is now there after the Erdogan so-called victory in these areas, I think, for ISIS to re-emerge again, or for another leader, or for ISIS to continue whatever it was trying to do in the past. I think the killing of al-Baghdadi is killing of one man. Defeating ISIS doesn't happen by killing the leader only. It happens by changing the ecosystem for that kind of terror group. And with the presence of the Turkish army in these areas, we saw, I mean, he was very close to the Turkish borders. From what we are hearing, American officials and leaks to the press that they did not even tell Turkey. So the defeat of the SDF or taking out the initiative from the hands of the SDF in the war against ISIS will create a much better circumstances for that group to re-emerge and to flourish once again, according to what we've been hearing from their websites and from their literature.
Well, let's get a view from the United States then. And Lawrence Korb, it was President Trump who announced this from the White House, and comparisons will inevitably be drawn with the announcement of the killing of Osama bin Laden. by his predecessor, President Obama, a few years ago. And this will be seen, at least in the short term, as kind of a win for President Trump, given the challenges that he's facing domestically. But beyond that, what effect does it have?
Well, I think it is, as you point out, a big win for President Trump, because not only did he get the leader of ISIS, which will blunt some of the criticisms he's gotten for withdrawing from Syria and not supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces. The other is that he worked with the Turks, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Russians, and the Iraqis on this. So this helps his image as somebody who's, working together. I agree with the other guests. It may have some problems, but in the long term, unless you undermine the ideology of these groups and what they're trying to accomplish, you're not going to eliminate the threat. We had already destroyed the caliphate. They basically had gone underground, and I think they will still try and plot attacks wherever they feel that they can, whether it's in the Middle East or Europe or even in the United States. And as we saw after we got bin Laden, there was a temporary lull, but it came back. And look at all of the Taliban leaders we've killed in Afghanistan, but we still haven't eliminated them.
Well, what about the security implications of this, Lawrence Korb, in terms of the loss of al-Baghdadi as a leader? What tactically does it do for ISIL in terms of his connections, his networks, and so on? Will it have much effect in that respect?
Well, in the short term, it will, because I think a lot of people who might be attracted to them are going to say, well, do they have intelligence on us? Will they be able to come, after us? Because even though the United States is taking its ground troops out of Syria, it's still going to have its air troops. And, we've been bombing several of the facilities in that part of the northwest and northeast Syria, where we thought that they may have headquarters of these various groups. So I think it'll get them to go underground for a while until they can see what the situation is in Syria. And the other thing I think, and it's important to keep in mind, the Iraqis played a big role in this, and they're still grateful for the fact that we came in and helped them after they lost Mosul. They're the ones who provided the intelligence that Baghdadi was actually hiding in an area that was controlled by al-Nusra, which had been an enemy of ISIS.
Andreas, let me turn back to you on this. Why was it so difficult to catch him for so long? Because there had been reports in the past that he had died in various attacks, and those turned out not to be true. Why had he eluded U.S. forces and others for so long, you think?
Well, I mean, this is his fifth death, actually, if you look at all the proclamations that have been made over the years. But, the thing with him is he has not been sedentary for the entire time of the caliphate. So even early on in 2014, when they had a physical space that they governed, Baghdadi wasn't someone who lived in a particular house and stayed there because he knew how very dangerous it would be, considering that obviously ISIS didn't really have an air force and the air power superiority was with the entire world alliance against him. So he was constantly moving, and he has been constantly moving. So that he was now found in Idlib, after all, it doesn't really say he was in Idlib for a longer period of time. Idlib is widely an ungoverned space. Neither the Turks, nor the regime, nor Assad, or the HTS, nobody really controls that area, and he was able to freely move around. Most people thought he would still be in Iraq, but obviously, despite the fact that the border was somewhat between Iraq and Syria was somewhat rebuilt, people are moving. It's a transnational space where people move from east to west, and he was constantly moving around. So it was very difficult to pin him down. Plus, he had a very low profile, and I think Trump's announcement to say that they capture quite a lot of interesting material or relevant material is probably false, because I don't think he had quite a lot of stuff with him. He must have traveled very lightly and very flexibly.
Hiwa, Osman, let me turn back to you on this. A lot of people have made mention of the fact that the conditions that led to the rise of ISIL haven't been addressed, and that's something that really needs further attention. What's your view on that?
Yes, indeed. I mean, since the when ISIS came or controlled all these large areas, there was a sectarian situation in in Iraq as a whole. The areas that were predominantly Sunni were controlled by by a sectarian Shiite army belonging to the then prime minister and proxies of Iran at the time. Still now, after the liberation of these areas, they are controlled by elements of Hashd al-Shabi, or the Popular Mobilization Force, that are known to be proxies of Iran operating inside Iraq. And a lot of the areas that are still, that are freed from ISIS and are being controlled, they still haven't seen development. They still haven't seen reconstruction. Many areas that were destroyed, they haven't been rebuilt yet. The people are largely unemployed. The large Sunni population that's in these areas is still very much on the margins. So even in terms of political representation, there are so many issues which we are seeing now, the uprising of the people in the center and the south of Iraq. The Sunni people of Iraq are not rising for now because they have been accused in the past of belonging to ISIS or the Ba'ath regime or whatever, or the Ba'ath party, or other reasons by the government. But now I think with the protests and the protests in Baghdad and the south of Iraq, eventually trouble could reach these areas, and it could be pave the ground for re-emergence of ISIS or ISIS 2.0 or 3.0. Now, on the Syrian side of things, the areas that ISIS was very much in control of were being fought. They were being fought in these areas by the SDF. Now, with American withdrawal from these areas, with empowering Erdogan, who is largely seen both in Iraq and in Syria as the patron of ISIS, ISIS was largely seen as the military wing of the AKP, Erdogan's party in Turkey. 40,000 fighters, according to Brett McCurk, who was in charge of the war against ISIS in Iraq and in Syria, said that they had come to ISIS areas, to Syria, from Turkey. Now, with Turkey in charge of the borders again, with the SDF being away from the borders, we could see a similar scenario of ISIS. The grounds are there for ISIS or ISIS 2.0 or whatever else for them to re-emerge in the areas that they were cleared off in the past with the coalition and the SDF. So the conditions are now, I think, back to where we started in that case.
Lawrence Korb, what's your view on that? What are the implications for ISIL of Turkey moving into these areas in northern Syria now?
Well, as has just been pointed out, I think this is good for ISIL because the Turks, all they're concerned about is the Kurds. They think that anybody who's a Kurd, regardless of whether they're part of the PKK or not, is a sworn enemy, which is why they're trying to, create a zone on the border with Syria. The Turks also want to send back all of the Syrians who emigrated there. Many of them could end up joining ISIS because of their unhappiness with what happened in Turkey and what was happening in Syria. So I think in the long term, the Turkish role there is going to be quite helpful to ISIS, unless Erdogan completely changes his view or we have a new election in Turkey. So I think that we need to keep that in mind and not think that just because we got Baghdadi, we can leave the area and we don't have to worry about ISIS anymore.
Andreas Krieg, there is a lot of details about this raid that we don't know about at this time. But I want to ask you, because for days, the U.S. officials on the ground had feared that ISIL would try to capitalize on the upheaval in Syria and the announcement of the withdrawal of U.S. forces. But in that respect, they saw a potential opportunity in which ISIL leaders would sort of come out from their secretive routines and their tunnels and so on to communicate with each other, and that may have created the opportunity for U.S. forces to locate al-Baghdadi and launch this attack. You think there's some truth to that?
Yes, I mean, we saw a lot more activity going on, even before the announcement of that raid last night. I mean, we saw that people were communicating. There was a lot on Twitter about new activities of ISIL people in their own, obviously, they have their own bubbles and echo chambers where they speak, which are mostly not public, obviously. And, you know, it was something that they wanted to exploit. And I do think that despite all this, I think ISIS will exploit this very event as well. Particularly the narrative now is that al-Baghdadi was blowing himself up, kind of evading capture and then and died as a martyr. I think that will kind of reinforce the martyrdom narrative that ISIS has been exploiting.
So this could be a recruiting tool?
They will probably try to make it a recruiting tool, and I think it's very important that Donald Trump, in his speech, was making al-Baghdadi look quite weak, almost like a wimp who was crying rather than someone who died a martyr's hero's death. And I think that's very important. Why I think the ISIS outlets will obviously present it the other way around, that he died a hero's death. So I think it's very important that this doesn't become a narrative campaign, because also for the Trump administration, this is a narrative campaign, because Trump is running for re-election, and I think that might be just his most important foreign policy achievement, if you will, in the region, and he will capitalize on that. And the 35% or so who are diehard Trump fans will probably cheer for it and say, look what he done. He actually single-handedly brought ISIS to an end.
Hiwa, Osman, speaking of narrative, a lot of governments in the West will be glad to hear this news of that the ISIS leader has been killed. But it's important to point out, isn't it, that it's people in the region, Arabs and Muslims, who've been bearing the brunt of what ISIL has wrought for years now.
Well, certainly people in the region, especially the victims of ISIS, and there are many of them in Syria and in Iraq especially, they will be very glad to receive the news, because this man is responsible for all the misery, for all the suffering that he created for the people. But again, at the same time, people, especially in Syria and in Iraq, are very worried that Trump might yet again change his mind with a tweet and change his policy and abandon the area totally and allow for another ISIS to emerge. And then they will be back with vengeance. The Iraqi state has proven now to be extremely weak. They are unable to overcome the difficulties that that they have been facing since 2003. The Iranian regime is now helping the Iraqi government to crush the protests in the south. So we have a very weak state in Iraq, and a weak government, and we have a very fragile situation in Syria with really very quite unknown variables on the situation, especially in the areas that ISIL was controlling as part of its caliphate. Now, with Turkey's role being there on the ground, as the guest in DC said, Turkey really cares more about the Kurds than ISIL. So they consider the Kurds as their enemy, not ISIS. And with the Kurds today not being able to fight ISIS as before, should they re-emerge, I think the prospects doesn't look very well for people on the ground.
One final question then to Lawrence Korb. Briefly, President Trump has talked about ending what he calls endless wars in the Middle East. Will he look at this as job done now?
Very definitely. Just like in 2012, the President Obama campaigned on bin Laden is dead. No doubt about it. And in the short term, this is a big win for him, because most Americans don't want to be involved. They're very upset going back to the Iraq war. So no, this is good. And that's why he spent so much time on a Sunday morning. It's very rare that a president speaks, you know, on a Sunday morning to the nation, and took questions after it too.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all three of you, Hiwa, Osman in Erbil, Lawrence Korb in Luz, Delaware, and Andreas Krieg joining me here in Doha. Thanks very much for being with us. And thank you, as always, for watching. You can see the program again anytime. Just go to our website, aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, you can go to our Facebook page on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hazem, Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.